Detective Aaron Blake had seen his fair share of cold cases. After 10 years in the missing persons unit of the Seattle Police Department, he thought he'd seen it all: runaways, abductions, and the occasional disappearance that resolved itself when someone decided to come home. But the case of Julia Harrison was different. It wasn't just her sudden vanishing act that unnerved him, it was the details, or lack thereof. Julia had been last seen leaving a cafe downtown. Surveillance footage from that evening showed her stepping out into the rain, her red umbrella flashing against the gray sidewalk, before the screen blinked into static. No other cameras picked her up after that, and her phone had gone dark around the same time. It was as if she'd stepped off the edge of the world. Blake stared at the photos spread across his desk: Julia's smiling face, a map of her last known locations, and a list of contacts. Each piece felt like part of a puzzle that refused to fit together. "Detective," a voice interrupted his thoughts. Officer Mia Thompson stood in the doorway, holding a thin file. She was a recent transfer, sharp-eyed and eager. "Another one." Blake's stomach sank. "Who?" "Mark Halpern. 32. Went missing last night after leaving his shift at the warehouse on 5th. His wife reported him missing this morning. No calls, no activity on his credit cards." She hesitated. "And there's something else. He worked at the same company as Julia Harrison." Blake leaned back in his chair, processing the information. 2 disappearances in 2 weeks, connected by the thinnest thread. Coincidence? He doubted it. "All right," he said, standing. "Let's head to the warehouse. Start with where he was last seen." The warehouse was a sprawling, dimly lit building at the edge of the industrial district. Inside, rows of shelves loomed like silent sentinels, stacked with cardboard boxes and machinery. The air smelled of oil and damp concrete. Blake and Thompson interviewed Mark's coworkers. Most had little to say. Mark was a quiet guy, kept to himself, didn't cause trouble. But one worker, an older man with a weathered face, mentioned something that caught Blake's attention. "He'd been acting strange the past couple of weeks," the man said, shifting uneasily. "Kept looking over his shoulder, like he was scared of something." "Did he say what?" Blake asked. The man shook his head. "No. Just said he had a bad feeling." Blake exchanged a glance with Thompson. Bad feelings weren't evidence, but they were often the start of something much worse. Blake and Thompson returned to the precinct with more questions than answers. The bad feeling Mark Halpern had mentioned lingered in Blake's mind. It wasn't unusual for people to act out of character before vanishing, but the connection between Mark and Julia was too specific to ignore. "Pull Julia's employment records," Blake instructed as they settled at their desks. "Let's see if there are any other coworkers who've gone missing or reported anything unusual." Thompson nodded, already typing away on her computer. Blake reviewed the notes from their interviews at the warehouse. Mark's coworkers painted a consistent picture: he was quiet, reliable, and didn't socialize much. But the mention of him being uneasy couldn't be overlooked. A ping from Thompson's computer drew his attention. "Got something," she said. "There was a third employee from that company who disappeared 3 months ago. Samantha Reyes, 27. Went missing on her way home from work. Case went cold after a week, no leads, no witnesses." Blake frowned. 3 disappearances, all tied to the same workplace. That's not a coincidence. Thompson glanced at him. "You think it's someone inside the company?" "Maybe. Or someone targeting it for a reason." The connection to the warehouse was their first solid lead, but Blake knew better than to jump to conclusions. They needed more information, and fast. "We'll look into Samantha's case tomorrow," Blake said. "For now, let's map out any overlap between the victims. See if there's more to this connection than the workplace." By the time they finished cross-referencing the victims' lives, the clock read well past midnight. Blake rubbed his temples, trying to stave off exhaustion. Julia and Mark lived less than 5 miles apart, Thompson said, pointing to a map on the screen. But Samantha was on the other side of town. Their routines don't overlap much, different neighborhoods, no shared hobbies, no social media interactions. Blake leaned closer. Wait. What about this? He pointed to a red pin on the map, a small diner located between Julia's apartment and the warehouse. Thompson checked her notes. Julia ate there the day before she disappeared. Mark and Samantha both worked late shifts nearby, so they might have stopped in too. It's a stretch, Blake admitted. But it's a lead. Let's visit tomorrow. The next morning, they arrived at the diner, a retro spot with neon signs and sticky booths. The waitress on duty looked frazzled, but she recognized Julia's photo immediately. Yeah, she was in here, the waitress said, wiping her hands on her apron. Nice girl. I remember, 'cause she seemed upset. Kept looking out the window, like she was waiting for someone. Did anyone meet her? Blake asked. The waitress shook her head. Not that I saw. But she left in a hurry. Didn't even finish her coffee. Do you have security cameras? The waitress grimaced. Sorry, no. Haven't worked in years. Blake sighed. Another dead end, or so it seemed. But as they walked back to their car, Thompson froze. Detective, she said, pointing to a telephone pole across the street. Mounted at the top was a camera. Traffic cam, Blake muttered, a flicker of hope igniting. Let's get that footage. Sometimes, the smallest details led to the biggest breaks. The traffic camera footage wasn't easy to obtain. Blake and Thompson had to navigate layers of red tape and deal with a city official who seemed more interested in his lunch break than in helping them. After hours of waiting, they finally received the files. Back at the precinct, they loaded the footage onto a monitor. The camera captured a stretch of road outside the diner, with a clear view of its entrance. Here, Thompson said, pausing the video. The timestamp read 8:12 p.m. Julia stepped out of the diner, her coat wrapped tightly around her. She hesitated on the sidewalk, glancing both ways before heading east. Play it through, Blake instructed. They watched as Julia walked down the street. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Then, a black sedan appeared, trailing her at a slow, deliberate pace. Did she notice it? Thompson asked. Blake rewound the footage. Julia turned her head slightly, as if sensing something. Her pace quickened, and the car kept its distance, following her until she turned a corner and disappeared from view. What's the plate? Blake asked. Thompson zoomed in, but the image was grainy. Can't make it out. We'll need tech to enhance this. Blake nodded, his mind racing. The sedan was their first real lead, but it raised more questions than it answered. Was Julia targeted, or was this random? And if it was connected to Mark and Samantha, was the same car involved in their disappearances? While the tech team worked on the footage, Blake decided to revisit Julia's family. Her younger sister, Claire, had been the one to report her missing. Claire Harrison lived in a modest apartment cluttered with books and half-empty coffee mugs. She greeted Blake and Thompson with tired eyes. Have you found anything? She asked, hope flickering in her voice. We're following some leads, Blake said carefully. I wanted to ask if Julia mentioned anything unusual before she disappeared. Did she seem worried or scared? Claire frowned, thinking. She wasn't herself the last few weeks. She kept saying she felt like someone was watching her, but I thought she was just stressed. She'd been working late a lot. Did she ever describe who might have been watching her? No, Claire said, her voice trembling. She just said it was a feeling, like she couldn't shake the idea that someone was always there. Blake exchanged a glance with Thompson. This matched what Mark's coworker had said about him acting nervous. Did Julia keep a journal or anything where she might have written about her thoughts? Claire hesitated, then nodded. Yeah. She had a little notebook she carried everywhere. I didn't think to check it. Let me see if I can find it. She disappeared into the bedroom and returned with a worn, leather-bound notebook. This is it, she said, handing it over. Blake flipped through the pages. Most of it was mundane, work notes, grocery lists, but toward the end, the tone shifted. Julia had scribbled fragmented thoughts. The car is back. It's always the same car. Am I being paranoid? I can't tell anymore. If something happens to me, it wasn't an accident. Blake's grip tightened on the notebook. Julia had known she was in danger. Back at the precinct, the tech team called them in. We enhanced the license plate, one of the technicians said. It's registered to a rental company. Looks like the car was rented under a fake name, but we're tracing the credit card used for the transaction. Blake nodded, his gut telling him they were getting closer. But closer to what? As he left the room, his phone buzzed. It was Claire. Detective Blake, she said, her voice shaking. There's someone parked outside my apartment. It's the same car Julia described. Blake's blood ran cold. Blake and Thompson sped through the darkened streets toward Claire's apartment. The city's lights blurred past the windshield as Blake gripped the wheel, his jaw set in grim determination. Claire's panicked voice replayed in his mind. Do not approach the car, he had told her. Lock the doors and stay on the phone with me. Now, as they pulled up to her street, they spotted the black sedan parked across from her building. Its engine idled quietly, the soft hum barely audible over the distant sounds of the city. There it is, Thompson said, pointing. Blake parked a few spaces back, cutting the lights. Stay here. Call for backup. He stepped out, his hand resting on the holster at his side. The air was thick with tension as he approached the car, keeping to the shadows. The sedan's windows were tinted, concealing whoever was inside. Blake stopped a few feet away. Police, he called out, his voice firm. Turn off the engine and step out of the vehicle. The car remained still, the only sound the low rumble of the engine. Now. Blake demanded, inching closer. Suddenly, the sedan's engine roared. The car lurched forward, tires screeching as it sped down the street. Blake sprinted back to his car, shouting into his radio. Suspect fleeing westbound on 5th. Black sedan, partial plate 7K2, need backup in a roadblock. Thompson was already in the passenger seat as Blake gunned the engine, chasing after the sedan. The streets blurred as they weaved through traffic, the siren slicing through the night. They're trying to lose us, Thompson said, gripping the dashboard as the sedan took a sharp turn onto a narrow side street. Blake followed, tires skidding on the damp pavement. Ahead, the sedan swerved wildly before slamming into a row of trash bins. The car came to a halt, steam hissing from the crumpled hood. Don't move. Blake shouted as he and Thompson exited their vehicle, weapons drawn. The driver's side door opened slowly, and a man stumbled out. He was in his 40s, disheveled, with blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. His eyes darted wildly, full of fear and desperation. Hands where I can see them. Thompson ordered. The man complied, trembling as he dropped to his knees. Blake approached cautiously. Who are you? Why were you parked outside that apartment? The man shook his head, his breathing ragged. I was just following orders. Whose orders? Blake pressed. The man hesitated, glancing around as if expecting someone to emerge from the shadows. I don't know their name. They send instructions, pay me to watch people. What people? The man's gaze flickered with hesitation. I don't know why. I don't ask questions. I just do what they tell me. Thompson cuffed the man while Blake searched the sedan. Inside, he found a tablet with a list of names and photos. Julia's face was among them, as were Mark's and Samantha's. Blake's stomach churned. This wasn't just about disappearances, it was organized, calculated. Who are you working for? Blake demanded. The man lowered his head. You don't understand, he whispered. They'll kill me if I talk. Not if we get to them first, Blake said. The man looked up, his eyes filled with a strange mix of dread and resignation. You can't stop them. They're everywhere. Blake exchanged a tense glance with Thompson. This was bigger than they'd imagined, and far from over. Blake and Thompson hauled the suspect, now identified as Anthony Russo, back to the precinct. He refused to speak further during the ride, staring blankly out the window with an air of defeat. Once in the interrogation room, they began their questioning. Blake leaned against the table, his tone firm but measured. Anthony, we've got your fingerprints on that tablet. It links you directly to 3 missing persons. You want to start explaining? Russo shifted uncomfortably, his hands cuffed to the table. I told you, I don't know why they're missing. I was just supposed to watch them. Report their movements. To who? Thompson asked, standing by the door with her arms crossed. Russo hesitated. They don't use names. I get messages through an encrypted app. Instructions, payments. That's it. Blake slammed his hand on the table, making Russo flinch. You're telling me you're willing to risk your life for someone you don't even know? Give me something to work with, Anthony. They're dangerous, Russo muttered. You don't understand what they're capable of. The people who vanish. It's because they step out of line. They see something they shouldn't. Blake narrowed his eyes. What did Julia, Mark, and Samantha see? I don't know. Russo snapped, his voice breaking. I swear, I don't know. All I do is watch and report. If I dig any deeper, I'm next. Thompson approached the table, placing the tablet in front of Russo. These names, are they all targets? Russo nodded reluctantly. Some are marked as high risk. Those are the ones who disappear. Blake leaned closer. And who decides that? Russo opened his mouth, but before he could answer, a commotion erupted outside the room. An officer burst in, out of breath. Detective Blake, you need to see this, he said. Blake exchanged a glance with Thompson before stepping out. The officer led them to a monitor displaying footage from the precinct's parking lot. A black SUV idled near the entrance, its occupants obscured by tinted windows. License plates? Blake asked. Swapped out, the officer said. They've been sitting there for 20 minutes. Blake's gut tightened. Whoever Russo worked for had found him, and now they were watching the police. Lock down the building, Blake ordered. No one gets in or out without clearance. Thompson, stay with Russo. He's our only link to whoever's behind this. In the interrogation room, Thompson sat across from Russo, her posture tense. Looks like your friends are here, she said, testing his reaction. Russo's face turned pale. You don't understand. If they're here, it's over for me. Not if we protect you, Thompson said. Russo let out a bitter laugh. You can't protect me. You don't know who you're dealing with. They own people, police, politicians, anyone they need. Before Thompson could respond, the lights flickered. The faint hum of the building's power system faltered, then steadied. Stay here, she said, stepping out to find Blake. In the hallway, Blake was coordinating with officers when the power cut out entirely. Red emergency lights bathed the precinct in an eerie glow. "What's going on?" Blake demanded. "Backup generator should kick in," an officer said, but there was an edge of doubt in his voice. Blake's radio crackled. "Detective, we've got movement outside. Multiple individuals approaching the building." Adrenaline surged through him. "Secure the perimeter. Don't let anyone in." As he turned back toward the interrogation room, a loud crash echoed from the direction of the holding cells. Thompson's voice came through his radio, sharp and urgent. "Blake, they're in. Russo's gone." Blake sprinted toward the room, his heart pounding. When he reached it, the door hung ajar. Inside, Thompson stood over an empty chair, the cuffs that had bound Russo lying open on the table. "How?" Blake demanded, scanning the room. "They hit us fast," Thompson said, her voice tight. "Flashbang, smoke. I didn't see who took him." Blake clenched his fists, the weight of failure heavy on his shoulders. Whoever they were dealing with had just made a bold move, and now their only lead was gone. The precinct was in chaos. Officers scrambled to restore order as Blake and Thompson stood in the empty interrogation room, the air thick with tension. "They planned this," Blake said, pacing. "The SUV outside was a distraction. They knew we had Russo, and they came prepared." Thompson nodded, her face grim. "Whoever they are, they've got resources. Smoke grenades, precision timing, this isn't some amateur operation." Blake's radio crackled. "Detective, we found something near the holding cells. You'll want to see this." They rushed to the scene, where an officer handed Blake a small device. It was a sleek black rectangle, no larger than a credit card, with a single red LED blinking on its surface. "Looks like a tracker," Thompson said, examining it. Blake frowned. They knew Russo's exact location. They must have planted this on him. Or he planted it himself, Thompson added. Blake's jaw tightened. Russo's behavior had been erratic, but the idea of him deliberately leading his captors to the precinct made him feel like they'd been played from the start. Back in the precinct's operations room, Blake and Thompson reviewed security footage from the breach. The video showed a coordinated team of masked individuals moving through the building with military precision. They deployed smoke grenades to disorient the officers, then extracted Russo in under 3 minutes. "Check this," Thompson said, pausing the footage. She pointed to the shoulder patch on one of the intruders, a faint logo that looked like a corporate insignia. "Can we enhance that?" Blake asked. The tech team worked on the image, and soon the patch came into focus, a triangular emblem with the initials Vialex. "What the hell is Vialex?" Thompson asked. Blake leaned back, racking his brain. The initials rang no bells, but their presence on the team's uniforms suggested an organization with a formal structure. "I'll dig into it," Blake said. "See if we can find any companies or shell organizations using that name." By the time Blake got home, it was nearly dawn. He collapsed onto his couch, his mind racing with possibilities. Russo's mention of high-risk individuals and Julia's cryptic journal entries painted a picture of surveillance, control, and selective targeting. But why? His laptop pinged with an alert. The search for Vialex had returned a lead, a corporation named Vialex Technologies. The company, based out of Chicago, specialized in data analytics and private security contracts. Blake's gut told him this was it. Vialex had the resources, the tech, and the plausible deniability to run an operation like this. But connecting them to the disappearances would require more than a hunch. The next morning, Blake and Thompson met in his office. "Vialex Technologies," Blake said, sliding a printout across the desk. Thompson skimmed the document. "Private security, data mining, government contracts, this screams black ops. They have facilities across the country, but their headquarters are in Chicago. I think Russo's abduction ties back to them. Thompson raised an eyebrow. You think they're behind the disappearances? Blake nodded. It fits. Surveillance of high-risk individuals, targeted removals, they're treating people like data points. The question is, why? Thompson frowned. If they're this powerful, we're not just poking the bear, we're kicking its damn den. Blake leaned forward, his voice low. We don't have a choice. 3 people are missing, and Russo's the only link we had. If we don't act, more could vanish. They decided to approach Vialex covertly. Using a subpoena to gather information would tip their hand, so Blake enlisted the help of an old friend, Nate Wilkins, a tech-savvy former journalist who specialized in corporate investigations. Nate met them at a diner on the outskirts of town, his laptop open and his fingers flying across the keyboard. Vialex is clean on the surface, Nate said, not looking up. But dig a little, and you'll find their fingers in some shady pies. Shell companies, offshore accounts, contracts with private prisons. What about disappearances? Blake asked. Nate paused, then pulled up a series of news articles. There's a pattern. Missing persons cases in cities where Vialex operates. No direct links, but the timing is suspicious. Blake exchanged a look with Thompson. This was the break they needed. What's their weak point? Blake asked. Nate grinned. Every fortress has a back door. Let me see what I can find. By the time they left the diner, Blake felt a glimmer of hope. If Nate could crack Vialex's defenses, they might uncover the truth. But as they drove back to the precinct, a dark SUV tailed them for several blocks before disappearing into the night. Blake's grip on the wheel tightened. They were being watched. The following evening, Nate called with news. I found something, he said, his voice low and hurried. Vialex has a secondary facility in Indianapolis. It's registered as a data storage center, but based on its security setup, it's more than that. Blake and Thompson met Nate at his small office, a cluttered space filled with monitors, wires, and stacks of paper. Nate pulled up a satellite image of the facility on one screen. Here it is, he said, pointing to a cluster of buildings surrounded by high fences and surveillance towers. Guards at all entrances, thermal cameras, and a secure underground level. Whatever they're hiding, it's in there. Can you get us inside? Thompson asked. Nate smirked. Not physically, but I can get you intel. I've already tapped into their employee database. If we can fake credentials, you might pass as contractors. Blake studied the screen. What's our angle? Maintenance? Exactly, Nate said. I'll set you up as a security systems team. That'll give you access to most of the facility, at least long enough to find what you need. The plan came together quickly. Nate provided fake IDs and contractor uniforms, complete with Vialex logos. Blake and Thompson rehearsed their cover story, a routine maintenance check on the facility's security network. They arrived at the Indianapolis facility at dawn, driving a plain white van with forged company decals. A guard at the gate stopped them, scanning their IDs with a handheld device. You're not on the schedule, he said, his brow furrowing. Blake remained calm. It's a last-minute order from HQ, system flagged an anomaly in the network. If we don't fix it, your cameras could go offline. The guard hesitated, then nodded. Go ahead, but stay with your escort at all times. Inside, the facility was sterile and cold, with long hallways lined with reinforced doors. A guard led them to the main server room, where rows of humming machines filled the space. Thompson plugged in a diagnostic tool provided by Nate, pretending to run tests. Meanwhile, Blake scanned the room, looking for anything out of place. His gaze landed on a locked door at the far end of the room. Unlike the others, it had no label, just a keypad and a card reader. What's behind there? Blake asked casually. The escort stiffened. Off limits. Only senior staff have access. Thompson glanced at Blake, her expression unreadable. We'll finish up here, she said, keeping her tone professional. Back in the van, Blake relayed what he'd seen. That door's hiding something, he said. We need to get inside. Nate, who was monitoring them remotely, chimed in. I might have a way. If you can get close to the keypad, I can remotely trigger a shutdown. It'll force the system into manual override. That'll draw attention, Thompson warned. Blake nodded. We'll have to move fast. That night, they returned under the cover of darkness. Using Nate's guidance, they bypassed the outer security cameras and made their way to the server room. As Blake approached the locked door, Nate's voice came through the earpiece. You're clear. Give me 10 seconds. The keypad beeped, and the door clicked open. Blake and Thompson slipped inside, finding a narrow stairwell that led underground. At the bottom, they entered a dimly lit corridor lined with glass observation rooms. Inside each room were people, some restrained to hospital beds, others sitting motionless in chairs. Monitors displayed their vital signs, along with streams of data that meant nothing to Blake. What the hell is this? Thompson whispered, her voice trembling. Blake's stomach churned. Experimentation. They're using people as test subjects. A clipboard on a nearby desk caught Blake's eye. It listed names, including Julia, Mark, and Samantha. Next to each name was a status, under observation. They're here, Blake said, his voice tight. Thompson scanned the corridor. We need to find them and get out. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from the stairwell. They're coming, Blake said. He and Thompson ducked into an empty observation room, their hearts pounding. Through the glass, they watched as two guards entered the corridor, talking in hushed tones. They know someone accessed the server room, one guard said. Check every level. Blake tightened his grip on his flashlight, his mind racing. They were running out of time. Blake and Thompson crouched in the observation room, their breathing shallow as the guards' footsteps drew closer. The hum of machinery was the only sound masking their presence. Blake's eyes darted to the door, they were running out of options. We can't stay here, Thompson whispered. If they check this room, we're caught. Blake nodded, scanning the space. His gaze landed on a ventilation grate near the floor. It was narrow but large enough to crawl through. Help me, he said, prying at the screws with his pocketknife. Thompson knelt beside him, keeping one eye on the guards outside. With a soft click, the grate came free, and Blake slid it aside. Go, he said. Thompson crawled into the vent, followed by Blake. The confined space was stifling, the metal walls amplifying every sound. Blake pulled the grate back into place behind them, praying the guards wouldn't notice. The vent system was a maze of twisting shafts and dead ends. Blake and Thompson moved cautiously, their progress slow. The air grew colder as they descended, and the distant hum of machinery reverberated through the metal. Do you even know where we're going? Thompson asked, her voice strained. Just following the airflow, Blake replied. It has to lead somewhere. After several minutes, they reached another grate. Peering through, Blake saw an empty storage room filled with crates and medical supplies. This looks clear, he said, pushing the grate open. They climbed out, brushing off the dust. The room was dimly lit, with a single door on the far side. Thompson opened one of the crates, revealing syringes filled with an unmarked liquid. What the hell are they doing here? She muttered. Blake didn't answer. His focus was on the clipboard sitting atop a nearby cart. Flipping through the pages, he found detailed records of the missing individuals, medical histories, behavioral assessments, and notes on response to treatment. Response to treatment. Blake read aloud, his voice tinged with anger. They're experimenting on these people like lab rats. Thompson grabbed his arm. We need to get this to the press. People have to know. Blake nodded, slipping the clipboard into his bag. The door creaked open, and they stepped into another hallway. It was quieter here, the sterile smell of disinfectant overwhelming. They moved quickly, checking each room they passed. Most were empty, but one caught their attention. Inside, a woman sat strapped to a chair, her head slumped forward. Her clothes were tattered, and her wrists bore marks from the restraints. Julia, Blake whispered, rushing inside. He gently lifted her head, his heart sinking. Her eyes were open but glassy, unfocused. Julia, it's me, Blake, he said softly. We're getting you out of here. Thompson checked the monitors attached to Julia. She's alive, but whatever they've given her has put her in some kind of stupor. Blake worked quickly to unfasten the restraints. As he freed her, Julia slumped into his arms, barely responsive. Come on, Blake urged. We're almost out. Carrying Julia, Blake led the way down the corridor. Thompson checked her watch. We've been here too long. They'll figure out where we are soon. Blake's radio crackled softly. It was Nate. Guys, I don't know what you tripped, but their security system just went into high alert. You've got maybe 5 minutes before this place is swarming. Where's the nearest exit? Blake asked. South wing, Nate replied. Take the next left and follow the corridor to the end. I'll disable the cameras, but you'll have to move fast. They hurried down the hallway, Julia's weight slowing them down. Blake's heart pounded with each step, the sound of distant alarms growing louder. When they reached the south wing, they found a heavy metal door marked emergency exit. Thompson hit the release button, but nothing happened. It's locked, she said, panic creeping into her voice. Blake glanced around, spotting a fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. He smashed the glass, grabbing the extinguisher and slamming it against the door's control panel. Sparks flew, and the lock released with a loud click. Go! Blake shouted, pushing the door open. They emerged into the cold night air, the facility's floodlights casting long shadows across the parking lot. There. Thompson pointed to the van they'd parked earlier. Blake carried Julia to the vehicle while Thompson climbed into the driver's seat, starting the engine. As they sped away, Blake glanced back at the facility. Guards were pouring out of the building, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. We're not out of this yet, Blake muttered. Thompson gripped the wheel tightly. What's the plan now? Blake looked down at Julia, her breathing shallow but steady. We take her to a safe house and figure out how to expose Vialex. They won't get away with this. But deep down, he knew the fight was far from over. The safe house was a rundown cabin deep in the woods, far from prying eyes and cell towers. Blake and Thompson had chosen it for its isolation, a place to regroup and strategize. Julia lay on the old sofa, her condition unchanged since they'd left the facility. Thompson had covered her with a blanket, checking her pulse every few minutes. She's stable, Thompson said, though her tone was cautious. But whatever they pumped into her, it's keeping her in this state. Blake paced the room, his phone in one hand and a clipboard in the other. Nate's voice came through the speaker. You guys made it out. Barely, Blake replied. But we've got Julia, and I'm looking at files that could bury Vialex. Nate hesitated. Careful with that. If they're willing to kidnap and experiment on people, they won't hesitate to come after you. Blake's jaw tightened. Let them try. They won't stop us from blowing this wide open. Thompson sat at the cabin's table, sifting through the documents Blake had brought. The more she read, the more her stomach churned. Look at this, she said, pointing to a page. They're testing a drug called LX-21. It's supposed to enhance cognitive function, but the side effects," she trailed off, shaking her head. Blake leaned over her shoulder, reading the same line: subjects exhibited heightened aggression, psychosis, and in 40% of cases, complete mental collapse. "They're using people as guinea pigs," Thompson said, her voice rising. "How is this even legal?" "It's not," Blake said. "But with their money and connections, they're probably untouchable. We need hard evidence to make this stick." Nate called again that evening with an update. "I managed to decrypt part of the files you sent me," he said. "There's a list of locations where Vialex is conducting these experiments. The facility you hit wasn't the only one." Blake's stomach sank. "How many more are there?" "5, Nate replied. "Scattered across the Midwest. And get this, each one has its own roster of volunteers. Most of them match the names of missing persons reported in nearby areas." Blake clenched his fist. "They've been covering their tracks by targeting small towns. No one notices when a few people disappear. But now we know," Thompson said firmly. "We can stop them." The next morning, Julia stirred for the first time. Her eyelids fluttered, and she let out a faint groan. Blake rushed to her side. "Julia? Can you hear me?" Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused but searching. "Blake," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "It's me," he said, relief flooding his voice. "You're safe now." Julia's gaze shifted, her expression clouded with fear. They took us. There were so many of us. We tried to fight, but they injected us with something. It made us. Her voice broke, and tears streamed down her face. "You don't have to say anything else," Blake said gently. "We'll get you through this." As night fell, the cabin's isolation began to feel less like safety and more like a trap. Thompson double-checked the locks, while Blake kept his gun within arm's reach. "We're sitting ducks here," Thompson muttered. "If they find us, it's over." Blake nodded, his mind racing. "We need to go public. If we can get this to the media, Vialex won't be able to hide." "But how?" Thompson asked. "We can't just walk into a newsroom. They'll intercept us before we get anywhere near a reporter." Nate's voice crackled over the radio. "I might have a solution. There's an investigative journalist I know, Grace Hall. She's been digging into corporate corruption for years. If anyone can help, it's her. Can you set up a meeting?" Blake asked. "Already did," Nate replied. "Tomorrow night, at a diner outside Evansville. It's low-key, and she's trustworthy." Blake glanced at Thompson. "This is our chance." The night passed in tense silence. Blake stayed awake, watching over Julia as she slept. Her earlier words replayed in his mind, "It made us." He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever Vialex had done to her, and the others, was only the beginning. By morning, they were back on the road, heading toward the meeting with Grace. Every mile brought them closer to the truth, but also closer to danger. Blake knew one thing for certain: Vialex wouldn't let them walk away without a fight. The drive to Evansville felt like it stretched for hours, though it was only a few hundred miles. Blake's thoughts raced as the miles passed, every turn of the wheel feeling like a step deeper into a world that had become far too dangerous. Thompson, as always, kept her focus on the road, though Blake could see the tension in her posture. They were both aware that the moment they met Grace Hall, their small window of safety would close. "Do you think she'll believe us?" Thompson asked quietly, her voice breaking the silence that had settled in the car. Blake shrugged, though he wasn't entirely sure. "She's been going after corporate corruption for years, so if anyone will take us seriously, it's her. But we'll have to show her the evidence. No one's going to take our word alone." "Julia," in the back seat, remained eerily quiet. Her eyes had cleared a little, but she still seemed disoriented, as if the weight of her experiences had drained her. Blake stole a glance at her. "How are you holding up?" Julia didn't answer right away, and Blake wondered if she even knew the question was directed at her. I'm not sure," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "Everything's still foggy. It's like I'm waking up from a nightmare, but I can't remember when it started or how to wake up fully." Blake's heart twisted for her. He could only imagine what she had been through. The diner was a small, nondescript place on the edge of town, just outside Evansville. Blake and Thompson arrived a few minutes before the scheduled meeting time. The parking lot was nearly empty, the night air cool and crisp as they stepped out of the car. "Let's get this over with," Thompson muttered, her eyes scanning the area. Blake nodded and led the way inside, where the fluorescent lights flickered above them. The diner smelled faintly of coffee and greasy food, its tables empty save for one in the far corner. A woman sat at the table, a stack of papers in front of her. She looked to be in her late 30s, with dark hair and sharp eyes that gave nothing away. As they approached, she stood and gave them a tight nod. "You must be Blake and Thompson," she said. "I'm Grace Hall." Blake shook her hand, wary but hopeful. "We need your help." The next hour passed in hurried conversation. Blake and Thompson laid everything out, the missing people, the evidence from Vialex's facility, Julia's condition, and the list of locations where more experiments were being conducted. Grace listened intently, taking notes without interrupting. Finally, she sat back, folding her arms. "This is big," she said, her voice steady but her eyes narrowed. "I've been digging into Vialex for months now, but this is something else." Blake leaned forward. "We can't do this alone. Vialex has resources and power. If we go public with this, they'll bury us." Grace nodded slowly. "I get it. They have deep pockets and political ties. But that's why I'm in this, because people like Vialex shouldn't be allowed to get away with it." She pulled out her phone. "I've got a contact in the Senate who might be able to help us with exposure. But we'll need irrefutable evidence, something they can't deny or sweep under the rug." Blake's eyes locked onto hers. "We've got that." He slid the clipboard from his bag and placed it in front of her. "This should be enough to bring them down." Grace took the clipboard, flipping through it quickly. Her face remained unreadable as she scanned the contents, but Blake could see her brows furrow. "This is damning," she said finally. "But I'll need more, names, records, photographs. Something that ties this directly to Vialex's board members." Thompson shifted uneasily. "How long will it take?" Grace stood up, grabbing her coat. "I'll get started right away. I'll need to meet with some trusted sources. But in the meantime, I'd suggest you lay low." Blake stood as well. "We can't afford to wait long. Vialex knows we're onto them." As they left the diner, a sense of dread washed over Blake. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "Let's go," Blake said, his voice tense. "We need to get back to the cabin." By the time they reached the car, a cold wind had started to blow, rattling the branches of the nearby trees. Thompson was already in the driver's seat, ready to go. Blake climbed in next to her, but before they could pull out of the parking lot, a black SUV rolled in behind them, blocking their path. The engine of the SUV revved, and Blake felt his stomach tighten. "This is it," he muttered. Thompson's hands gripped the wheel tighter. "What do we do?" Blake looked out the rearview mirror, where two men in suits had emerged from the SUV. They were walking toward the car, fast. "We don't have a choice," Blake said, pulling out his gun. "Drive." Thompson hit the gas just as one of the men reached the driver's side. Blake aimed his weapon at the man, but Thompson's speed pushed them forward. The man stumbled back, his hand reaching for his own weapon, but they were already too far gone. Blake exhaled sharply. They know we're here. Grace has to be careful. But as they sped away into the night, Blake couldn't shake the feeling that their time was running out. The road stretched out before them like an endless ribbon of asphalt, the headlights cutting through the dark, the hum of the tires on the pavement a constant companion. But Blake couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his gut, the SUV, the men in suits, it was clear Vialex was closing in. We're not safe anymore, Thompson muttered, her grip still tight on the steering wheel. They know everything. Blake sat in silence, his thoughts racing. The men in the SUV had made it clear that this wasn't just a warning. It was a message. Whoever was pulling Vialex's strings wanted them silenced, and fast. Julia, still quiet in the back seat, hadn't said much since their meeting with Grace. She was a shell of the woman she had been before, the drug, the trauma, it all weighed heavily on her. Blake turned to her, his voice soft. You doing okay back there? Julia looked up, her eyes filled with a blankness that unsettled him. I don't know if I'll ever be okay again, she said, her voice trembling. What they did to us, to me. I can't remember half of it, but the parts one do, she trailed off, shaking her head. I don't want to remember. Blake wanted to say something comforting, but the truth was, he didn't have the words. Not for her, not for himself. All he could do was keep pushing forward. They all needed a way out. By the time they reached the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted. The once dull sounds of the rural landscape felt heavier now, as if the air itself was thick with danger. Blake's instincts were on high alert, but he knew they couldn't run anymore. They were cornered, and the truth was, they had no choice but to fight back. We need to contact Grace, Blake said, breaking the silence. She's got the connections, the access. She's our only shot. Thompson nodded. I'll try to get a signal. She stepped out of the car, holding her phone up, trying to find any faint trace of reception. Julia, still silent, remained in the back seat, lost in her thoughts. Blake was about to get out when he heard a faint sound, a rustle, like something brushing against the outside of the cabin. His body tensed. His eyes scanned the trees, the shadows too deep to make out anything clearly. Thompson, he whispered. Get inside. Now. She froze, her phone still in her hand, her eyes locking with his. The rustling came again, closer this time. He could feel the tension crackling in the air. Without another word, they both ducked inside the cabin, and Blake grabbed the handgun from the glove compartment. They moved swiftly, silently, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Julia hadn't moved. Her eyes were wide, locked on the door as if she already knew something was wrong. She didn't ask what was happening, she just looked at Blake, silently pleading for something he couldn't give. The door creaked open. Blake's heart stopped. A man in a black suit stood at the threshold, holding a folder in his hands. His face was stern, unreadable. Blake Carter, right? The man asked, his voice calm, almost too calm. I think we need to talk. Blake's mind raced. He couldn't make out the man's face entirely, but something about his posture, confident, almost arrogant, set Blake's nerves on edge. Who are you? Blake demanded, his voice tight. The man stepped inside, uninvited. My name's William Reed. I'm with a different branch of Vialex. We have some business to discuss. He motioned toward Julia, still sitting motionless in the back seat. You should have left her to us. Blake's grip tightened on the gun. I'll ask you again. Who the hell are you? Reed sighed, almost like he was bored. Let's just say I handle the cleanup. When people like you get in the way, we make sure things get resolved. No loose ends. Blake's pulse quickened. This man wasn't just a lackey. He was something worse, someone who dealt with the aftermath, the people who went too far, the ones who had to be erased. "You're not getting her," Blake said, his voice low, the gun now trained on Reed. "Get out of here." Reed smiled, a thin, predatory grin. "You don't get it, do you?" He took a step forward. "You're not in control here. Vialex will find you. They'll wipe you out, and when that happens, there won't be anyone left to remember your name." Blake's finger hovered over the trigger, but something held him back. He knew this man wasn't alone. He could hear the faintest sound of footsteps behind Reed. More men, more suits, Vialex's cleanup crew, as Reed had so kindly put it. "I don't think you want to do that," Reed said, his voice turning cold. "Because if you do, I'll make sure you never see tomorrow. Not just you, but the girl, and the officer. You'll all vanish." Blake's mind was racing. He was trapped. They were all trapped. Then, a thought hit him like a lightning bolt. "Tell me something," Blake said, his voice suddenly calm. "Why are you so interested in us? You could have just left, gone after Grace. Why come all the way here for us?" Reed's smile faltered for a moment. It was just a flicker, but Blake caught it. The man's confidence was slipping. "You're asking the wrong questions," Reed said, but Blake could hear the tension in his voice. Blake took a slow step forward, keeping the gun steady. "No. The question is, why are you so afraid of the truth coming out?" Reed's expression darkened, and for the first time, Blake saw fear, real, palpable fear, in his eyes. Before Reed could react, Blake fired. The shot echoed in the small cabin, the sound of it shaking him to his core. Reed staggered back, a bullet wound in his shoulder, but he didn't fall. "Go!" Blake shouted to Thompson, his voice breaking through the sudden chaos. "We have to move, now." Thompson grabbed Julia, dragging her out of the car and pushing her toward the door. They didn't look back. Blake fired again, hitting Reed in the leg, but the man managed to stumble backward, disappearing into the trees. "Get in the car!" Blake shouted, running after them. As they sped away into the night, Blake couldn't help but wonder what kind of world they had just entered, and how they were ever going to survive it. The car barreled down the dark highway, its headlights barely cutting through the thick veil of night. Blake's hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white with tension. The sound of tires skimming the road was the only noise in the car. Julia, still in shock, sat between Blake and Thompson, her wide eyes scanning the rearview mirror every few seconds. "Do you think we lost them?" Thompson asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She was keeping her gaze fixed on the road, but Blake could tell she was just as shaken as he was. Blake didn't answer right away. His mind was running through every scenario, every possible route they could take, every way out. The threat from Vialex wasn't just real, it was closing in on them fast. And that feeling of being trapped wasn't just an instinct anymore, it was a certainty. "I'm not sure," Blake replied, his voice tight. "But we need to figure out what Grace has. We can't keep running forever." Thompson glanced at him, her brow furrowed. "But we can't go back to her. They'll be watching her, and they know we're tied to her now. If we go back—" "I know," Blake interrupted, cutting her off. "I'm just thinking. We need to find somewhere safe, a place to lay low, while we figure out how to hit them where it hurts." Thompson turned the car down a narrow, overgrown side road, one that Blake hadn't noticed before. It wound through the dense woods, away from the highway and away from the eyes that might be watching. Blake glanced at Julia again, but her eyes were unfocused, staring ahead as if she wasn't even there. "Julia," Blake said gently, reaching back to touch her shoulder. "You need to snap out of this. We're going to make it through, but you have to stay with us. You hear me?" She didn't respond at first, but after a long moment, she slowly turned her head toward him. Her lips parted, but her voice came out barely above a murmur. I don't know who I am anymore. Blake felt his heart tighten. He knew what she meant. Whatever Vialex had done to her, whatever experiments they had run, had stripped away parts of her, the parts that made her whole, made her real. She had become a casualty in their game. Hey, Thompson said softly, glancing over her shoulder at Julia. You're still here. You're still with us, and we're not going to let them take you. Julia's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak. They stopped at a small, run-down motel at the edge of a town, its neon sign flickering weakly in the dark. Blake didn't want to stay there, but he knew they couldn't risk being out in the open. The place was a dump, but it would do. The owner, a middle-aged man who barely acknowledged their presence, handed Blake a key and pointed them toward the back of the building. Once inside the room, Blake immediately went to the window, peering through the blinds. There were no cars in sight, but that didn't mean they weren't being watched. Thompson set up her laptop, trying to get a connection to the internet. We need to get the rest of the information Grace promised, she said, her fingers flying over the keys. But it's going to take time. She said she'd be in touch when she had something concrete. Blake didn't sit down. He couldn't. The urgency inside him pushed him to keep moving. We don't have time. They know we're still alive. They know we've got proof. And they'll come for us. They'll come for Grace. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise, the sound of a phone ringing, cutting through the silence. It was Thompson's phone, her hand still on the keyboard. She picked up the phone quickly, glancing at Blake, her face drained of color. It's Grace, she said, her voice tight. Blake crossed the room and grabbed her other phone. Put it on speaker. Thompson nodded, pressing the button. Grace's voice came through, distorted by the static of a bad connection. Blake, Thompson, are you there? Grace's voice was urgent. Listen, I don't have long. They're on to me. They know I've been talking to you. Blake's stomach dropped. What's going on? What did you find? Grace hesitated, then spoke quickly. I dug into Vialex. I went as far as I could without getting too deep into their network, but I found something. A pattern. The missing people, they're not just random. They're part of a larger scheme. Vialex isn't just running experiments. They're recruiting people for something bigger. Blake's mind spun. Bigger? What are you talking about? There's a project, Grace said, her voice growing faint. A classified operation. It's not about the experiments. It's about creating assets, people they can control, people with special abilities, manipulated by their technology. The missing people, they're being bred, harvested, for this project. Blake felt the air leave his lungs. You're saying, they're creating super soldiers? Grace didn't answer immediately, but the weight of her silence said it all. That's just the beginning. Vialex has been using genetic modifications, targeting people with specific skills, then using their technology to enhance them. Make them stronger, faster, harder to kill. Thompson's voice broke through the conversation. How do we stop them? Grace's voice went cold. You need to go public. Expose them. The media can be a weapon, but only if you have the proof to back it up. The government won't act without it, but once they see what's been happening, that's when we'll have a chance. Blake's heart raced. This was the final piece of the puzzle, but it felt like a death sentence. And Grace? Are you safe? The line went silent for a moment, and Blake's pulse quickened. I don't think so, Grace said, her voice barely audible. I've been compromised. But I've already sent the files to a secure location. You'll find them in your inbox. Use them wisely. The call cut off. Blake slammed the phone down. The room was silent for a long moment, the weight of Grace's last words hanging heavily in the air. "Now we have no choice," Thompson said quietly, her fingers frozen on the laptop keyboard. "We have to expose them, no matter the cost." Blake nodded, his mind made up. They had all gone too far to back down now. The truth was out there, and they were the ones who had to bring it to light. But as Blake stood there, looking out into the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The real battle was just beginning.